Hello, and welcome to this week's Asthma Spotlight podcast. So this week I'm going to talk about asthma attacks and some of the times of year and some of the triggers that can spark off asthma attacks. And before I do, please do follow me, and if you do like these podcasts, please share them with others. It is available on Spotify, Apple, and my own website at bigcatdoc.com. Now, when asthma goes out of control, that's called an asthma flare-up or an exacerbation or an asthma attack. The term exacerbation is often used by doctors and asthma nurses. However, I prefer the term asthma attack or asthma flare-up, which is the term that's used by most people with asthma. Now, whatever you call it, these episodes of uncontrolled asthma can be very severe and must always be taken very seriously. So how do you know if you're having an asthma flare-up or an attack? In short, this is whenever you're getting new symptoms from your asthma. As I've said in previous podcasts, asthma is an ongoing, chronic, underlying disease that's there all the time, and it does flare up from time to time. So you may have no symptoms at times, and at other times you may have coughing, wheezing, or shortness of breath, which is called an asthma flare-up. Now, of course, the controller treatment, also called the preventer treatment, keeps asthma under control and helps to prevent attacks. So if you have asthma and you've not been prescribed a controller or preventer inhaler, or if you're not taking it as prescribed by your doctor, you will be much more at risk of having flare-ups, and you'll have more flare-ups or attacks than people who are taking their preventer medication regularly. But sometimes asthma does flare up even if you are taking a controller drug, and this is usually an inhaled corticosteroid inhaler. If you listened to my podcast on severe asthma or difficult to treat asthma, you'll remember that if you are taking your medication regularly and as prescribed, and you're using your inhaler device correctly, and you're still having asthma attacks or flare-ups, that's a signal that you might have difficult to treat or severe asthma, and you do need to consult your doctor urgently so that this can be investigated, and if necessary, so that you can be referred to a specialist. Okay. So why does asthma flare up and why do you get attacks? Now there are four main reasons for these attacks. I've already mentioned the first reason, that is if you've not been prescribed or if you're not collecting or not taking the prescription prescribed by your doctor. That could be a reason why you're having asthma attacks. The second reason, which is linked to the first, is that you're having attacks because you are only taking a short-acting reliever inhaler. That's a bronchodilator, and it's usually a blue inhaler for your asthma. So you might be taking a short-acting reliever inhaler as your main treatment for asthma because that's the only treatment you've been prescribed, or that you may have also been prescribed a controller and for some reason you're not taking that and you're not following your doctor's advice, and you're only using the reliever inhaler. Now, the third reason for having attacks is that you've been exposed to a trigger factor. So-called trigger factors because there are things that can spark off attacks, and I'm going to focus on this reason in this podcast. The fourth reason for having asthma attacks is that you may have severe asthma, as I've said earlier. And I have discussed this in detail in a previous podcast, in particular in episode 17 and episode 41. And if you think you may have severe asthma, then have a listen to those podcasts and discuss this with your doctor or asthma nurse, because you will probably need to be referred to an asthma specialist clinic. Okay, so I want to talk about triggers for asthma flare-ups or attacks. A trigger is a substance or an emotion or a time of year where circumstances can spark off an asthma attack. So let's start with the times of the year that can trigger asthma attacks. Starting with people who are allergic to certain things, their asthma may flare up during particular times and particular seasons of the year. Spring is a time when some people have more asthma attacks. This usually happens in people who are allergic to tree pollen. When the tree blossoms start appearing in the early spring, you might be getting symptoms, and if you are, you might be allergic to tree pollen. You might also have allergic rhinitis with runny nose, itchy nose, and sneezing a lot. So your asthma would go out of control at the time when the trees first start to blossom. Asthma in the summertime is often caused by grass pollen or some particular harvests, like, for example, rapeseed harvests. That's the yellow crop that you see when you're driving on the motorways. Next, in the autumn or the fall, there are often fungal spores around. So if you're allergic to these, your asthma may flare up at that time. Then in the winter, as you turn on your heating, you may have asthma attacks due to increased numbers of house dust mites developing in your home. Of course, house dust mites are in our homes all year round. So if you're having symptoms all year round, that may be due to house dust mite allergy. So if you find that your asthma flares up like this in different seasons, especially if you get nose or eye symptoms like runny or itchy nose or itchy or runny eyes, as well as your asthma symptoms, that's coughing, wheezing or shortness of breath, you may be allergic to something which may need treatment. So see your doctor, who may be able to make a diagnosis based on your medical history, or you may need a referral to an allergy clinic to find out what's causing your symptoms. I want to mention some other triggers that occur in the summertime. Firstly, there's the so-called back-to-school asthma, where young children have asthma and asthma attacks when they return to school after a holiday. And the other trigger is called thunderstorm asthma, relevant today because today we had lightning and thunderstorms in London. In the first trigger, which is usually in the late summer when children return to school, mostly after summer holidays, many children, mainly younger children, have asthma attacks at this time. Now, the main reason for these attacks is that the children share their virus infections that they bring back to school. These are infections that they might have caught while on holiday or towards the end of their holidays. And as you know, many children will cough without covering their mouths, and so virus particles get sprayed around the classrooms. And as a result, lots of children have attacks sparked off by virus infections. Another possible reason why children have attacks when returning to school after a break is that they may have stopped their controller medication while on holiday, and that's usually the inhaled corticosteroid inhaler. The other seasonal trigger for asthma is called thunderstorm asthma. Now, these are episodes where many people have asthma attacks associated with thunderstorms. These so-called epidemics of asthma happen when there are particular circumstances. There's usually a very dry, hot period, which lasts a week or two, and there's usually a lot of pollen around. It might be grass pollen, tree pollen, or fungal spore pollen. And then there's a particular type of thunderstorm called a mesostorm, where during the storm, pollen grains are split into very small, tiny fragments, and they are thrown up into the air during the storm. So as a result, people are exposed to very high concentrations of these tiny pollen particles that are breathed into the lungs. And as a result, many people who've been exposed have asthma attacks. Now, many of these people have had previous episodes of allergic rhinitis or hay fever. This is where you get sneezing and itchy nose and runny nose when exposed to certain trigger factors like pollens. Now, there's another very special kind of exposure to dust particles, and historically this caused a lot of people to have asthma attacks. This was first noticed in a harbour in Barcelona, where on particular days, many people had asthma attacks. And these were caused when workers were unloading sacks of soybeans. When these were unloaded from the ships and dropped on the ground, soybean dust was thrown into the air, with the result that many people had asthma attacks. So, of course, these sorts of asthma attack epidemics can happen when people are exposed to large amounts of particular dusts, for example, in the farming or painting or baking or fishing industries. So if you're having asthma attacks related to exposure at work, it's important to mention this to your doctor and to ask for a referral to an occupational health specialist. The clue here is that your asthma may be worse at work and it improves on days when you're away from work or on holiday. The other kinds of triggers that are most common are exposure to virus infections, exposure to fumes like open gas fires, barbecues, fireworks, and of course we're coming up to that time of the year when there are lots of firework displays. Exposure to cigarette smoke or vaping smoke can cause asthma attacks, and so can strong perfumes. And in addition, exercise and laughter can trigger asthma attacks. So if you notice a pattern associated with your asthma flare-ups or attacks, be sure to mention this to your doctor or your asthma-trained nurse. And unfortunately, you may not see the same doctor every time, so they may not be aware of this association. So please do mention this to the doctor or nurse when you consult. Why? Because then you may be advised how to prevent these attacks, usually with regular controller drug treatment, that's mainly inhaled corticosteroid, which both controls the underlying asthma and prevents flare-ups, exacerbations, or attacks. Now, the other reason to mention these associations is because you may need to be referred to a specialist to find out exactly why you're getting these attacks. So, in summary, I've suggested that you try and notice any things or situations that trigger your asthma symptoms. So try and notice and identify any associated triggers that might spark off your asthma. Common triggers for asthma attacks are virus infections, allergies, and exercise. Other factors at different times of the year may spark off your asthma flare-ups or attacks. Now, if you're taking a controller inhaler properly, i.e. you're using the device correctly, and you're taking it as directed by your doctor, and your asthma is still being triggered, i.e. you're still having attacks, you may have severe asthma and you may need referral to a specialist. So it's important to mention this to your doctor. The bottom line is really that if you take your controller inhaler, as I said, that's usually an inhaled corticosteroid, as you've been advised to do by your doctor, then no matter what triggers your asthma, the attacks can be prevented in the majority of situations.